Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Building a Business Case for Enterprise Search. There are some initiatives that we all know will have positive outcomes. We have to just justify it, and that can be hard. Enterprise Search is one of those initiatives. Today, we're going to talk about how to build a business case for Enterprise Search that will actually help you transform the digital workplace. My name is Diane Burley. I am Head of Content for Lucidworks, and today I'll be joined by my colleague, Senior Solutions Engineer, John Lenker. We're going to give you actionable takeaways to make the argument that AI-powered search can bring consumer-like experiences to the workplace, how it will personalize insights, and more importantly, improve employee engagement, collaboration, and retention. First, some housekeeping. The lines are muted, but please send in your questions. We'll answer them as you send them in. Just use the chat button. So let's find out how to build the business case for Enterprise Search. Hi, John. How are you?
Hey, Diane. How are you?
I'm great. When you and I first started talking about this webinar, you used words like personalizing insights, employee engagement, collaboration, and retention. And those are words we use when we talk about e-commerce search. Now, you've been involved in enterprise search for more than a decade, but you had your roots in e-commerce first. Are there really such parallels between search for employees versus search for shoppers?
There certainly are, and I'm sorry.
No, go on. Are there such parallels?
There certainly are, and I think this is the case where people may not realize that this is true, and in fact they may believe it's not true. But this is, I guess the intent of the webinar is to show you that it is true and that it is a case you can build. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Well, what makes building this business case so difficult for people?
They really don't see the parallels. They think that shopping and internet or enterprise type search are completely different things. And they are different, but they have enough similarities in terms of what the business is concerned about in terms of customers. Your customers in shopping, of course, are people that are buying things, but your customers in a workplace or enterprise search context are your users, your employees. And the parallels that you draw there are hard to see if you don't really have the information that you need going into that to make that parallel or to draw that line to the two things together. And they often want to measure enterprise search return on investment the same way they measure it in e-commerce. And, of course, that is a very difficult line to draw to connect the two. And that's something that we hope to reach in this webinar as well, is how do you do that? I mean, there's an entirely separate talk on measuring ROI in detail for enterprise search, and that's just a piece of the case that you build for your case for enterprise search in the workplace.
So where do you recommend we start?
Before you get into the whole ROI discussion, you really need to understand the problems with enterprise search in the workplace. So a lot of experience of mine in this space has been with companies that have had problems with their existing intranets or their existing technologies, or they simply don't have a technology. And we'll get into the different types of problems that stem from that main problem, but that's the first goal, is to understand what is wrong with the current setup, because before you understand that, you can't begin to measure any goals or in return on investment or anything like that.
So what we've done here is we've broken it out into two personas, if you will, employees and managers. So let's look a little closer on how they might go about describing the current state of problems and pain.
This is a great slide for that, because in this context there are two types of people that are involved. One type of person is the end user or the employee, and the second type of person is usually a decision maker or a stakeholder of some kind, and that can include IT staff. So often the IT staff has to support the actions of the end users and in fact protect them from themselves. And the management or the decision makers not only have to worry about the satisfaction level of the users of the solution to justify it, but they also don't understand the needs of the solution oftentimes, and they're also going through the process of exploring different vendors. Maybe they don't have a technology at all, so they have to shop for solutions, or they have a vendor and that vendor may have retired a product, let's say, and so then they have to shop again. So these are the types of things that the management or stakeholder side of the house has to encounter. And then the cost of not acting is part of that too. So if you look at these bullet points under the management side on the right, you have fees, you have cycles spent cleaning or analyzing data. Those are things that all kind of roll up under vetting the vendors, considering what happens if you don't act, and analyzing the needs for the business. And then on the left side, you have the employer, the end user side of the house. And this is where people run into complaints about, oh, well, I have 5 or 6 systems I have to log into in order to find information. I can't find it all in one place. I have to go here, here, and here for 3 different things. There's lousy precision. The accuracy is often poor, and we see this in one major enterprise search player in the current market. It's just not good enough at this point. So we have these 2 sides of the equation that we have to consider when we're making our case.
Right. So now we go in and we want to frame the desired state. Where do we want to be? You've taken all of these problems and pain, and now you're actually coming up with a solution?
Right. So after you define what your problems are and you get that list created, that's an important step. I mean, that really is your first step. The next step is to determine, what do you want to see? What do the end users actually want to see? And this is something that you can determine through interviewing them and sending out surveys, things of that nature. You talk to your IT staff if you're a decision maker, let's say. Let's say you're at the CTO level or some other management level, and you have the ability to make decisions in this regard. This is where you would start asking your IT staff, what are your current problems? Tell me about the user's problems. Tell me about the staff that's supporting the technology. And then your desired state for that management side on the right is a business model that's flexible, first of all. So the technology needs to be able to grow and adapt to the needs of the business as they change. And oftentimes you have vendors that have products that they just stop supporting, or they have retired the product altogether. And so that has a sunset timetable on it. And those are the types of things you don't want to encounter as a manager, or you at least want to minimize them. And under that, you need that technology to be extensible. Like I said, if you're growing your business and the business is changing, you need the technology to be able to change with you. And then you have the desire for the workload on the IT staff, meaning how much time are they manually spending investigating logs and cleaning up data and formatting things? You want a technology that can help you in that regard. So that's on the management side. And on the other side, on the left, is the employer, the end user side. And something I just addressed a second ago is that one interface. This is perhaps, I think, the most important thing that I've seen for end users in terms of a change in their attitude. They finally see one place that they can go to perform a search that will hit the, let's say, 5 or 7 or even upwards of 20 different sources of data, and they're able to do that in one spot. That people end up loving when it's done properly. They next want something that's relevant to their jobs, and this is where we'll talk about personalization and contextualization when it comes to teams. So things that are relevant to shoppers in the e-commerce space, meaning maybe their purchase history or some of their brand associations, those types of things are components of good enterprise search also. It's just that people don't often think about that. And they also want to be in a discovery mode sometimes, and a lot of end users don't even know this. So what I see in the market is people often don't know exactly what they're looking for. Some people do, and some people search that way sometimes, or most of the time maybe. But there are other times when they're in discovery mode, which is, I really don't know what I'm looking for. I need your help to kind of discover what it is I need to find. And you need a search technology that will do that.
Right. You don't even know what it might have been called. I mean, you know, when you work across different departments, somebody else may be calling an item in a totally different way than how you might be describing it with your keyword search.
Correct, and that's something that you see often with global companies, where you have different cultural things that are crossing lines there, and you have different things called, same products or lines of business called different things in certain parts of the world. So that's a good example of that. Thank you. And then finally, things that autocorrect and auto-suggest. This is very much a consumer experience. People want that in their workplace experience. And then perhaps even more importantly than that are the trends in our culture now with the way we interact with devices. We ask our phones, we ask Amazon Echo and Google Home and these devices questions, and people are wanting to search for things in their commerce and their workplace experience in that same way. So we need to address that technology as well.
All right, so what do we do next now that we've created yet another list of items?
And you don't want to get too list happy. I mean, my intent is not to tell you that you need to just create a bunch of lists and then throw your hands up and say, now what? But the lists are important, even if you don't write them down, to come up with a plan in your head as a strategy. Now that you have a desired state and a way to get to that desired state, you have to create requirements, because especially in big companies, things don't happen in a technology sense without requirements. You need design requirements or goals or business goals. So those things need to be done. And the requirements that I think are important for making a case for this in an enterprise context is comprehensive indexing, for one, meaning this is one solution. This needs to take all of the disparate sources that you have and not only present one area for your users to search those sources, but you also need to bring all of that under one technology in terms of getting it into an index. One easy interface is, again, back to that end user experience. Query analysis is something that you need the search engine to do so that you can spend less time worrying about the health and accuracy and relevancy and results of that product. And under that fall a couple things that are of primary importance. Synonym detection, I think, is huge in the workplace, just like it is in e-commerce. But again, going back to that cross-cultural reference or the global corporation type of reference, when things are called one name in North America and another name in Europe and maybe a third name in APAC, you need synonym detection as well as synonyms for just generic operations that people do in search. And then tuning is something that your IT staff needs to be able to do manually, meaning they have to have some control over it, but they also want that search engine to do some of the work for them in an automated fashion. And then when we get down to the last two here, this is the personalized UX is something that I'll harp on from an enterprise search standpoint, because I'm a big believer in taking that personalized e-commerce experience to the next level when I talk about team contextualization, and I'll get into that. And then finally, again, natural language support, because if you're a visionary in this space, in this market, you're going to see that that's the way culture is going, and you want your employees to have that same experience in their work intranets.
You know, Joan, the first part of these requirements really outline why you need strong search, but the latter part, now we're talking about AI, machine learning, and deep learning. Yet I noticed that you put transparent tuning. Is that because you need to be able to get at those algorithms? Is that something that you really are a fan of?
Yes, I mean, you have to have control over what the search engine is doing. The black box search engine, while it may have been popular at one time and it may have been, I guess, trendy or cutting edge in some ways, that is no longer what I see in the market. I see people that want some black box technology when it comes to modeling. Maybe they don't have a data science team that's at their disposal. So they need some sort of black box type of tuning modeling or algorithmic modeling. But at the same time, you want to be able to control what the search engine is doing and dictate things to it. And so the best of both worlds is what you're trying to achieve there, and it is possible.
All right, talk a little bit about how machine learning and deep learning can actually impact and create these solutions you're desiring.
This is where the rubber is going to meet the road in terms of the connection between e-commerce and the digital workplace or the company intranet type of experience. This is where I want people to really understand that these two things are more similar than you thought. And the first example of that is contextualization. So we touched on personalization, which if you do any shopping online, you know that there are plenty of retailers out there that are good at this, and they know what's important to the individual. But let's focus on contextualization, because in the digital workplace, now that becomes infinitely more important than in a shopping experience, and that is what is important to the group. That's what I mean by contextualization. And by group, I mean in a workplace, you have departments, you have teams. In a law office, for example, you might have practice areas. You might have, in oil and gas, you might have regional teams. You might have corporate hierarchies or organizational structures that define your groups. There are a whole bunch of different ways that this gets defined in the corporate or the digital workplace experience. that is something that is very underused and is something that we try to push on our prospects when we're selling our product, that contextualization of the group is paramount. This is something that you cannot ignore if you want a good digital workplace experience. And then the way that this all ties together, personalization and contextualization, is through signals. And you need a search engine that can collect user feedback and behavior and analyze it, and then feed it back into the system to learn about what is important to people. And that is also of course, very important in shopping and e-commerce, but it is of significant importance in the enterprise search space as well. Again, something very underrated. And then the last two here are kind of tied together when it comes to what is actually going to work and prove that it's working. So the tedious task, if you're an IT person or a search technologist, you know that maintaining synonym dictionaries or phrase dictionaries or stop words or things like that can be tedious, and in the right size company can be overwhelming at times. With a particular search engine product, you might want to automate your synonyms. You might want to use things like head-tail analysis and the analysis of underperforming queries, all in an automated way. And then you need a way to prove that this is working. So the last bullet point on that slide was the analytics piece. What is going to show you the health of the engine? What's going to show you the impact or the effectiveness of what you're doing with those things? So that's the last piece of that puzzle.
John, we got a question, and I think we should take it now. The person is asking, what is the trend in natural language queries in the enterprise? Is it growing? And what percentage of those are seen compared to, let's say, keyword searches?
That's a great question. I'm glad that whoever asked that question. That is something that it's in the early stages. From what I've seen in the market right now, it's kind of an emerging technology. So in terms of a percentage keyword searches, I think it's low. I think in most corporate environments, that is probably in the less than 20% range, especially when the corporation doesn't have the capability to support it. But I have a current prospect right now that is planning their roadmap for search and in their enterprise, and that is actually one of their top 3 things in their goals for the project, is the ability to natural language or to handle natural language queries properly. And so you're going to see that grow. And the reason I'm making a big deal about it is that you want to be ahead of this curve. This is something where you don't want to be catching up in the space. You want to actually be ahead and be implementing and handling that as it grows in popularity and culture.
Perfect. So now that we have all these components of our case, how do you go about making the argument?
I think the argument for this is actually pretty easy, and it's kind of like building out your case for e-commerce. You have to have goals, and usually in e-commerce, the goals are so easy. You just talk about making more money. What's going to get my conversion rate higher? Well, there are things that occur in enterprise search that will also show you metrics on your goals, and your goals should be to basically threefold. You have 3 pillars here on this slide, with the 4th on the far right being a summation or a roll-up of all of the previous 3. And we'll go through each pillar here real quickly. The first is the machine learning and AI. That is not just for e-commerce. If you haven't heard that already in this webinar, then please hear that loud and clear. This is something that you really need to leverage in a digital workplace, and it will make a big difference. The second is the more difficult piece for people thinking about digital workplace, and that is, how do I measure the return on investment of this thing? I mean, yeah, I can do that in e-commerce. If my conversion rate goes up, my bottom line changes, there's a direct correlation. It's very visible. It's easy to measure. Well, in the enterprise search context, this is both quantitative, like it is in e-commerce, and qualitative, and that's also a very underrated and important thing. This is something that you want to measure, even though you can't measure it maybe with numbers and statistics. You want to see that your end users and your employees actually like using the intranet, because when they do that, it turns into efficiency and productivity, which will impact your bottom line.
Now, you mentioned that it's both qualitative and quantitative, but I mean, you actually can measure it. You can actually dig in there and determine what the monetary savings are. Yes,
and I have a method for measuring the the qualitative piece of this, and you can get creative with that, and it's something I've talked about in a different presentation. But the way to do this from a quantitative standpoint is through metrics, and it is through having specific parameters outlined. And I'll give you an example of that. We have a customer. It's a giant rideshare company. You probably have a 50-50 shot of guessing which company it is correctly. But this company is on the mission of changing their intranet. So forget their customer-facing piece for a moment and just consider their internal use, their enterprise search or workplace use case. They were on a mission to transform it. They noticed some problems. They defined those problems like we alluded to earlier. They mapped out something that was a desired state for them. And then in order to convince the business decision makers that they needed to make the investment, they wanted to measure it. And when I first got a hold of this example, I said, there is no way that they did this with the numbers they gave me. They gave me these high-level numbers, and I said, frankly, to the guy that I interviewed extensively, I said, look, I don't believe you. There's no way that you saved that much money. I need to know exactly how you did it. And so he presented a plan to me, and we'll go through it real quickly here. I have an entire presentation on this with more detail in a separate webinar, a separate presentation that I think we'll send out to our participants here today. But just to go through it at a high level, they only rolled this out to half of their user base. That's one key point to make. Another key point to make is that they only were concerned about delivering the results to the user. They were not concerned with the quality of the results, and that's very, very important to hear, so I'll repeat it. They were only concerned with how quickly and how efficiently the users got to the results and not about the quality. That was phase 2. Phase 1 was simply getting there, so keep that in mind. They also measured the average hourly salary of their employees, and they measured their total work hours per day across this user base. And then they came up with a goal, which is, I want to make each person 2 minutes a day more efficient, meaning I want them to spend at least 2 minutes less per day searching for things and actually presenting them with items faster. That was the goal. It sounds very simple, sounds actually insignificant, but when you add that up, it does create some huge numbers. And so when they did this, they used metrics, and the metrics that they did or that they used for this are all in that other presentation, and I'm happy to take questions about them. But just suffice it to say that when they finished their measurements, they ended up saving about $650,000 per month. And after they weighed the cost of the investment in our product, that computed to an ROI of 15 to 20 times per year on an ongoing basis. And that's when I said to the guy, before I heard how he did it, I said, there is no way. That is absurd. That's an absurd amount of savings. And he said, it's real, and here's how I did it. So this is something you can measure, and that's the point I want to make, and that's really one of the big pieces of this presentation.
Awesome. So let's talk about the qualitative side, and this is where I got a kick out of when I saw your slides. The first word that jumped out at me was delight. The idea that we're delighting our fellow colleagues here. Just wanted to describe that a bit.
Oh, sure. This is something I've seen in corporations, and it might sound maybe trite or silly, or maybe I'm just inflating or exaggerating this by using this word here, but I'm really not. I've actually been in front of customers where we have made a tremendous change in their technology, meaning we've taken something that they've been, I guess, laboring through or tolerating at best in their intranet for a long time. And we present an entirely new intranet to them, and we show them that you can actually preview documents before you click them, and you can bookmark them and like them and save them for later and email them to a colleague or download them. And all these actions, by the way, are the things that drive the signals that we were talking about that determine how search gets better. But when people are actually pleased with what they have previously been laboring through, it delights them. And I've actually had people shriek with delight. It sounds ridiculous, but I've been on conference calls and they've gone, oh my gosh, I love this. And when you hear that, you think, are you that impacted by just a change in your intranet? And trust me, when you've had the wrong kind of internet for the longest time, that kind of reaction can come from some people. So this is what happens when they start to trust what they're seeing. A lot of the times we don't trust the results, and therefore they're not confident that the internet is worth using or the search is worth using, which in turn leads to the executives saying, well, why waste the money on this? This is pointless. And it's a vicious cycle, and you can break that cycle with a number of factors we've talked about, but that one key piece in the qualitative area is how people like the experience.
Great. So now we're at the final pillar, or the business value. So why don't we go through that?
Yes, sure. This is the summation or the roll-up of the previous three pillars. So just to go through this, when you talk about your users and employees, those are your customers. So you think about them in the e-commerce context as your shoppers. These are your customers. These are people that are buying from you, so to speak, in your company intranet. And when they become more efficient, like we saw with the rideshare company example, when they become more productive, when they're delighted by the experience that they get, especially when they've been tolerating something else for a while, that increases their morale. And that qualitative piece is part of the value of the solution. Yes, you're not going to put that on paper and say, look, we saved X number of dollars by making this user group happier. Now, you can measure that in terms of how efficient they are. If they're happy, of course, you can't measure that. But it's so important because any good leader, any good technology leader especially, knows that morale in a company can either sink or float the company to new heights. So it's an important thing to remember. The second piece is that the solution evolves, and this is around the technology pillar. So the AI and the ML, this is something that needs to learn from itself. It needs to grow. It needs to flex with your business. And these are things that are important to the value of it as well, because you don't want to be spending more money in the future on redoing something or jettisoning a product and getting another one in there. And then finally, that second piece, and then to a degree that first piece, really some people are only going to be focused on the bottom line. And so when you do this right, it will save you money. And when the bottom line changes, there are some people, especially at the C level, that are going to say, I'm not going to spend the money until I see that the bottom line is going to be affected by it.
So I'm assuming you have some sort of product in mind that will roll up all of these requirements and solve all these problems.
I do, and I have a lot of experience in this industry, and I've used a lot of different products. And this is the product that I've found to date that really can solve all the problems. There are some products that solve some of them. They do a great job at that. There are some products that try to encompass everything, and they're not really good at any of it. Think kind of like the Cheesecake Factory menu, where they offer you everything under the sun, but maybe you think that not everything is great at Cheesecake Factory. They just offer you a whole bunch of choices. There's that type of solution. And then there's Lucidworks Fusion. This is a solution that takes into consideration all of these pain points we've talked about, all these problems that enterprises face, and attempts to bring together the solutions that the e-commerce space loves with what the digital workplace and the enterprise search space really needs. And they don't even know they need it most of the time. So the way that we do this with Fusion is by honoring those three different types of data that we see in every enterprise: system-generated, things that the system itself is going to create, like log files; human-generated data, the behavior of the users, what they're clicking on, downloading, etc. And then the application, what it's generating, the actual data that you're pulling in. If you're a law firm, it might be your database management system, or if you're an oil and gas company, it's the data that gets pulled in from all the scanned well documents that you've got across decades, things of that nature. And we pull that all into the search engine that is based on Apache Solr and Spark at its core under the server piece, but the AI machine learning pieces that go on either side of the server, meaning the indexing and the query side, are what make a lot of these things we've talked about happen. And then there's a final component to it, which is App Studio, and that's where you can raise the eyebrows of some people that are interested in saving money. Because a lot of time, enterprises will spend a lot of money on front ends. They'll pay designers, they'll pay technologists that specialize in front ends, and these cycles are typically long. App Studio is a product that aims to minimize that deployment time and that time to value. So that's another piece you can use when you're building the ancillary portion of your case. And that all leads to a solution in the digital workplace that accomplishes all the things that we just outlined.
John, we've had a ton of questions, so I just want to let people know that John has indicated that he can stay on and answer, so just keep sending them in. One of the questions we have is, does the contextualization, signals, and automation of tasks include auto-tagging of metadata?
Excellent question, and thank you for that. That is part of it. This is something that I didn't touch on because I didn't think we had time to cover it, but part of the ingestion side that I think is critical to the enterprise is just that. So auto-tagging with metadata, clustering, topic detection, these are things that will take a workload off of your shoulders if you employ the right technologies. And yes, that is part of the intelligence or the machine learning piece of the puzzle there.
Another question. Unlike in e-commerce search, enterprise search business needs a high level of accuracy. Is it possible to achieve accuracy more than 95% in the beginning stage?
This is something that I don't typically encourage my customers to put a number on when they're launching a new technology, especially if it's a large departure from an existing technology or perhaps something brand new and they don't have an existing technology at all. I'd be careful about measuring accuracy near the 100% mark when you first launch a project, only because you're not going to have a plethora of user behavior to help you with accuracy. And relevance, as we've seen in our experience in the market, both in e-commerce and enterprise search, relevance is highly, highly assisted by the use of signals and user behavior. So until you have a project that you've given enough time, let's say based on the size of your corpus and your user base, weeks or months to build up some sense of user behavior, some catalog, if you will, then you don't want to start measuring accuracy right away. Obviously you want it to be at a baseline level more than at least 50% to start. And any good modern search technology will be able to deliver that. But when you approach that 100% mark, you want to incorporate the use of machine learning, because that is the gap filler between your standard enterprise search experience and what you should be getting with near 100% accuracy.
Perfect. So how did that company estimate the time spent by employees searching for information internally? And do you have some recommendations for best practices on capturing this engagement?
Yes, and this is where you would leverage your web development team or the part of your IT staff that has visibility into the operations of the internet itself, the web pages, the calls out to scripting or the server, whatever it may be, whatever technology you're using. In the case of our rideshare example, they use metrics such as query response time. They use dwell time on pages, meaning how long do users wait before they click on a search result after they've typed in a query. And this is something that a lot of people miss. This is something that is a big metric in e-commerce when it comes to the ancillary part of user behavior. But in enterprise search, this is one way this other company really leveraged the time spent. Is oftentimes when someone runs a query and they hit enter or they click the magnifying glass, they get the results back and they're perusing the results, seeing if anything that they are getting back is actually what they wanted. And the time that they take to do that can be an indicator that the results are not good. The accuracy is low, the relevancy is poor. And so this company in particular used that as one of their major components. And they saw that the time being spent, the dwell time being spent before an action occurred, lowered with installation of new technologies. That was one of the comparable metrics they used. There are a number of other ones too that we can get into, but I'm happy to take some more questions.
Yeah, and we're going to take three more, and then I think we'll let you go onto your next gig. What are your top 2 to 3 most important metrics for measuring search experience?
In terms, well, search experience is kind of broad. In terms of the quantitative side of it, well, I'll give you the qualitative side of it briefly. The top 2 or 3 that I would measure are, or the ways that I would measure them are A/B testing, meaning, or what I call the Pepsi challenge in another presentation I gave. get your existing intranet up against your new solution, whether it's in a QA phase or some kind of user acceptance phase, get them side by side, and have an end user or a group of end users go through and execute similar behaviors on both of the solutions, and just ask them what they liked and what they didn't like, what they thought was missing, what they hope to see, such and such, things like that. That's part of the qualitative experience. The other thing is to interview the end user, not with a Pepsi challenge in front of them, but just interview them as to what they hope to see in the experience, or give them a feedback button. And this is a way of indirect interviewing. So some companies I've worked with will actually, on their search results page themselves, put a feedback button next to a result that says something like, was this helpful, yes or no, or allow you to input more information. So that's one way to measure the qualitative side of it. The top 2 or 3 metrics for measuring the quantitative side, I think the rideshare company laid this out for us really well. The first one I'd measure is query response time. So if your system is performing better, and this is something where SharePoint search in particular is really poor with query response time oftentimes. When you have a different search technology that's better at that, the query response time, that little difference in milliseconds adds up. And so the course of a day, if someone is a knowledge worker and executes, let's say, 2 or 3 dozen searches in a workday, those little bits of time add up, kind of like when you make tiny deposits in a savings account over time. And so that's one way to measure it. And the other key one, I think, is that dwell time component. This is something that is often overlooked, but I really think it's important when you're measuring enterprise search effectiveness.
All right, we'll make this our final question. How does Fusion differentiate from open source solutions out there?
That's a great question. Fusion is, of course, based on open source technology, but what you're not getting with Solr, out-of-the-box Solr, you get with Fusion. And if you wanted to build on top of your out-of-the-box Solr what you get with Fusion, you would be looking at a considerable development effort. And the major differentiators are the way that Fusion can handle the ETL side of the house, so the connectors to different source systems, the ability to configure indexing pipelines, and, for example, in contrast to something like SharePoint search, where you really only have one endpoint when you're ingesting content. And never mind that you don't have connectors with SharePoint search, but you'd have to build them. But you only have one endpoint to handle any kind of manipulation or enrichment of the input. So on the ETL side of things, the indexing pipelines that give you the ability to use natural language processing, to use auto-tagging of metadata, topic detection, clustering, all of these types of things, that's huge, huge differentiator from Solr. And then perhaps an even greater differentiator is on the query side, where you have that same technology, natural language processing, query intent. You have the use of signals. This is something that's completely missing from Solr out of the box, is the use of machine learning in terms of behavior. So these are things that really separate Fusion from an open source offering on its own.
All right, sounds great. John, I want to thank you, and I want to thank all of our listeners, especially for staying on and taking all these questions. It was a great presentation. We will be sending out the archive along with some of those resources that I think you'll find very helpful. Thank you, everyone, for today.
Thank you all for joining. Thanks for being with us this afternoon.